Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water because the election season was over, here comes the Denver mayoral election. Along with the Right to Survive initiative being on the Denver ballot, the spring civic elections in Denver could end up dominating the conversation the same way the 2018 midterms did in Colorado. David, can Mayor Michael Hancock avoid a runoff election?
Possibly, yes. There's lots of game to be played. In fact, it's barely gotten started. So sure, yeah, you can imagine scenarios where he does great. You know, I wouldn't call it a 50-50 bet that he gets through without a runoff, but we've had plenty of mayors who sometimes seemed in shaky shape at one point, and then Bill McNichol's re-elections sometimes didn't look good at one point, and then he ended up winning comfortably. I think the Right to Survive initiative is very important. And that's obviously something the city council didn't want to pass, and this is exactly why it's good that we have ballot initiatives so that people can decide on very important issues for their city. And this is something which will, if enacted, have a very huge influence on Denver. It is to say that if you can turn every public park into a permanent campground for the homeless, and in fact, if some guy who's living in a car wants to park in front of your house and live there, for months or years, that person can. That could have very large quality of life impacts in all possible directions. And voters, I hope, will look at other cities that have tried it and see what the results were there.
Eric, in 2018, we had a spirited, to say the least, a governor's race and election. Lots of money being spent there. But the ballot issue didn't overshadow it, but it had just as much, if not more, money spent and headlines dedicated to it. Could we see that same dynamic in the Denver election, where we have a mayoral race that is important and makes its own headlines, but in the Right to Survive initiative making its own energy with the ballot?
Well, I think the Right to Survive initiative will get plenty of attention, plenty of discussion, but no, I think the mayoral race will dominate. I think we ought to fasten our seatbelts. I think this is going to be a fun ride, at least. It's going to be a ride. We didn't have a race here 4 years ago. It was just an automatic slam dunk re-election for Michael Hancock. That will not be the case here. I think the real contest is the early contest for who is going to emerge as the challenger to Michael Hancock. I think there will be a challenger. I think whether it's our friend Penfield Tate or a woman Jamie Gillis, possibly Lisa Calderon, but my money would be on either Tate or Gillis, unless there's a new name that we haven't heard yet, as the one that emerged. I flash back in 1983, going way back, there was a big pool of candidates. Federico Pena emerged as the credible challenger to Dale Tooley and Bill McNichols. When Norm Early was the front runner, Wellington Webb emerged as the challenger. Hickenlooper was not the front runner when he got in, but he quickly emerged. Mary DeGroote in '95, when Webb was vulnerable, emerged from a pack.
She won the initial election, right?
She won the initial election, lost the runoff. And then most recently, Hancock was not the favorite. That honor belonged to Chris Romer 8 years ago, and Hancock emerged from the pack. Denver mayoral elections are not like Senate elections, not like governor's elections. It's much more a reach out and touch kind of situation. People feel much more immediately affected and immediately involved. Somebody's going to emerge from this pack and give Hancock an interesting race, in my estimation.
Natasha, in 2018, in a statewide campaign that we saw all these different counties and communities vote no on a lot of ballot initiatives. In Denver was this island of everything goes. If it was a tax initiative, it was a whatever initiative, it all passed in Denver. Denverites were in a very generous mood. How does that affect the civic elections in spring, knowing what we just saw in 2018?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see if we are that positive. What's interesting about the city election is that now we're going to drill down to more, I guess, differences. These are neighborhood races. So if you look at the who's running against who for these elections so far, almost all of the races are contested, from clerk down to the various city council positions as well. So the mayoral race is going to get a ton of coverage, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about them. But I'm going to also focus quite a bit on the city council races, because I think that's going to give us an indication of where there are differences in the city, how people feel about growth, how they feel about changes in their communities, how they feel about housing, how they feel about all kinds of issues that may not be as, we all agree on this as we saw in the last November election.
Patty, the Right to Survive initiative reminds me a little bit about Proposition 112 from 2018, where you have, it's seen as a little extreme. It has a grassroots support, but not a whole lot of money behind it, and a large coalition of businesses, and from what I've seen, other organizations who are terrified of it passing. Do you think that's an apt comparison as you see it for next spring?
Well, except that 112 didn't pass, and it's not impossible that this will. You've got to remember that the measures that the boosters and the business people who are going to be fighting the right to rest, their transportation bill didn't pass. So some of the other measures they were pushing didn't pass statewide, and we had all those kind of social engineering ballot measures in Denver, which even raised taxes, pass, including one that's going to drastically change campaign finance, not on this election, but on the next one in Denver. So, I mean, we're going to have psilocybin mushrooms. We might be voting on whether we have to vote on the Olympics. We're going to have a lot of issues that I think will really galvanize this city, and especially because in the neighborhoods, they're also going to be involved because of their city council races. So we're going to have plenty to talk about for the next 6 months here.